Alright, so today we're going to talk about ingestive behavior. What we mean by ingestive behavior, typically we're going to think about eating and drinking. Okay. Now, there are many reasons why you might eat or drink, right? We are not going to be interested in all of those, right? Those are things maybe for other classes, right? That you might think about some of the emotional reasons. We'll briefly touch on those. But what we want to think about for today are what are the physiological processes that drive the behaviors of eating and drinking. Why do we do this? How do we know to start eating or drinking? How do we know to stop eating or drinking? What are the brain regions involved with this? And we might think about some other interesting hormones that control this process. So it'll be exciting. So again, we'll briefly talk about drinking. Then we'll talk about eating. From there, we will talk about metabolism, starting a meal. We'll talk about stopping a meal. And we will briefly touch on things like obesity and eating disorders. Alright, I don't think just switch over to the pointer. Alright, for ingestive behavior, again, we're thinking about eating or drinking. We really need to think about this concept of homeostasis, right? We've touched on this a couple times this semester, but when we think about homeostasis, we want to think about what is that set point level where we are at the optimum operating conditions, right? Typically we think about this with temperature. For our purposes, things that are going to be important are things such as glucose level. Also, we want to think about fluid balance and fluid levels, right? When we're thinking about eating or drinking, we want to think about whether or not we are ingesting the right amount of water to make certain that we're maintaining our internal environment so that the proper chemical reactions can occur, right? Okay. And we have a ton of mechanisms that help control this process. So we'll think about those. Today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the hypothalamus. We've talked about the hypothalamus before. We mentioned the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus when we talked about circadian rhythms, right? We've talked about other parts of the hypothalamus as we've gone through this process. Today, we'll think a little bit about the lateral hypothalamus and the ventromedial hypothalamus. We'll think about those a lot when we get to the eating portion of the lecture, when we think about those things. But keep in mind this story with hormones, right? We've talked about hormones for the last couple weeks. We're going to talk about hormones again this week, right? Trying to highlight again how much of your behavior is under the control of various hormones, right? So I think that's really sort of an important thing. This is why we have a whole branch of medicine, right, called endocrinology. How many of you are aware, maybe you've been to an endocrinologist, maybe you know someone who's been to an endocrinologist, right? These are folks who, these are doctors who will help you with your endocrine system. That's the hormone system, right? We've talked about different hormones and how they can get out of balance and cause you problems. We'll talk about some more of that today, okay? First, though, we want to think about feedback loops. Okay, we'll talk about positive, negative feedback loops. We want to think about these regulatory mechanisms, or what we might call a feedback loop, right? Now, we talked about a positive feedback loop in the past when we talked about oxytocin and trying to get a fetus out of your uterus, right? We talked about that sort of positive feedback loop. It works because the problem, right, your offspring stuck in your uterus has a very limited amount of time, right? Once that offspring is out, then your uterus can stop contracting and everything's fine. Other problems we can't really correct in the same way, right? So, Sammy, let's imagine you're getting too hot, right? What's the solution if you're overheating? It's to cool down, right? It's not to heat up more. right? So the solution with the child in your uterus was to continue to contract the uterus even more powerfully, right? So keep moving in that same direction. It doesn't work that way. You're not going to heat yourself up so much you start to cool down. That doesn't happen, right? So if you get too hot, you have to have a mechanism that helps you cool. If you get too cold, you have to have a mechanism that helps you warm, right? And so you have to move in opposite directions. So if we're thinking about these regulatory mechanisms, first we have to have some variable, right? So if we want to think about temperature, if we want to think about how much oxygen is dissolved in your blood supply, if we want to think about anything, what's the availability of nutrients, right, to your body? What is the sort of osmotic pressure of your cells, right? Are they full of water or are they not full of water? Any of these can work. We have some preferred temperature. We have some preferred pH. We have some preferred fluid balance, whatever that is. That's our set point. How many of you are aware that your blood pH should always be between what? Like 7.35 and 7.45, right? Typically we say like 7.4 is the pH that you want for your blood. If it goes above or below that too much, you really run into some serious problems, including one of the biggest problems you'll ever face, and that's death. So that's sort of an unsolvable problem at this point, but you guys can put it off as long as you can. That's the goal, right? Talk about procrastinating on problem solving, right? Just put that one. I'm going to put that one off until the end of my life, and then I'll deal with death at that point. So there you go. We have to have some way to detect that variable, right? So we have something that measures temperature. We have something that's going to measure blood oxygen levels. We have something that measures whatever variable it is, and then we have to have a way to correct that mechanism. We have to have some way to come back and adjust up or down as appropriate. And as we said, most of these processes are going to be negative feedback, right? So when your body temperature gets too high, what are things that you do to reduce your body temperature, right? You start to sweat, and that's a mechanism. You do other things, okay? If you get cold, what's one of the things you do? You start to shiver, right? And so that can generate some heat by moving your muscles, right? And so you move one direction or the other. Now what's interesting about this, and this is actually pretty fascinating. How many of you have ever been thirsty? It happens, right? And some of you may have been truly dehydrated, right? And this can happen. So you may have actually been at a serious deficit with water. And that would mean you don't have enough. We'll talk about different kinds of thirst, but maybe you don't have enough water either in your vascular system, or your cells don't have enough water, right? And so they're kind of shriveled. Either way you go, the solution to that is to ingest water, okay? And you're going to ingest water. Now, how long are you going to ingest water if you're thirsty? 30 seconds, right? It's not very long. So you have a bottle of water, you drink that bottle of water, and then you say, oh, well, I'm done. The problem with that, Seth, is let's imagine those cells that were short on water are in your foot. Okay? That happens, right? Your foot is dehydrated. The rest of your body is too, but we're going to think about your foot. You're going to ingest that water. Let's say even it takes you a couple minutes to drink a bottle of water, right? Do you think in that 2-minute time the water that you've ingested has actually made it to the cells in your foot? Not at all, right? But somehow your brain says, hey, you should stop drinking, right? We've ingested enough water to solve our problem, and then we're fine. So I think that's a really interesting mechanism, right? And so these satiety mechanisms are really kind of fascinating. We'll talk about those in a bit. Because if you were to continue to drink water until those cells in your feet were properly hydrated, well, that would be a real problem, right? Because your stomach only holds so much water, and you just have water kind of coming out the top. Just like keep pouring it in, and just like keep coming out. You're not really doing any benefit, right? It's the same thing with eating, right? How many of you have ever been hungry? It happens. How long did you spend eating food? Let's say half an hour, right? And that's probably if you took your time, right? You guys can eat a cheeseburger in a couple minutes if you really put your mind to it. You did not wait. You did not continue to eat until all of the nutrients were delivered everywhere in your body, right? You just put some food in your stomach, and your stomach's like, okay, we're full now. You don't have to eat anymore. We'll handle it from here. So those are those satiety mechanisms. All right, this is a regulatory system. We talked about this. Not a big deal. Here's the basic outline of that regulatory mechanism that controls drinking. So your body's going to lose water, right? And we have detectors, we'll talk about what those are specifically in a moment, that will say, hey, we can tell you are losing water. You've lost so much water, we need to replenish that. So that'll activate those mechanisms of drinking. There are brain regions that control this. Talk about those in a minute. That's going to put water in your stomach. Okay. Now, two things happen here. One, and this is the short step, right? Once your stomach's full of water, that satiety mechanism kicks in and turns off the drinking. Okay. Simultaneously, those fluids are being absorbed back into your body, right? Which can also turn off the mechanism. That's a much slower process, and it takes more time. Okay. So you have to turn it off quickly with the satiety mechanism, and then prevent it from coming back on through that long-term absorption, right? Anybody have questions about this? It's not too bad, right? We should think a little bit about where you have fluids in your body. Some fluid is in the cells, some of it is outside the cells. Another important sort of space for fluid are in your blood vessels, right? So all your blood vessels contain some fluid. And then there's even fluid between the cells, right? So that's the interstitial fluid. If any of these fluids, you lose enough of any of these fluids, there are mechanisms that will be triggered that cause you to drink to replenish them, right? And so there are actually two types of thirst that we really want to think about. One of those is the result of hypovolemia. Okay. What we mean by hypovolemia is you're losing intravascular fluid. So basically you're losing blood, right? Now that fluid you could be losing could be because you have a massive hemorrhage, right? So let's say you've nicked an artery and you're losing blood out of there. Obviously that's going to reduce intravascular fluid volume, right? Because your blood's just kind of pouring out. You do a couple things to prevent that from happening. Your blood vessels will actually start to constrict so that they can make the volume smaller. The problem is if you lose too much blood, what happens to your blood pressure? It goes down, right? And if your blood pressure goes too far down, then you run into that problem that you cannot solve called death, right? So you'll die from that. I know that was a shocker, right? If you lose too much blood, you die. Nobody was prepared for that today. So, Rebecca, I don't see that you wrote that down. Do you need to take a moment? You think you have a handle on it? Okay. Great. Of course, the problem with this is you can only constrict your blood vessels so much, right? And then you're going to have to start doing other things to try to correct this. So that correctional mechanism only has like a very small bit of help it can do for you. It has a definite limit there. Okay. So we can lose blood volume. That's going to make us thirsty. Most of blood, for those of you that don't know, is plasma. And most of plasma is just water, right? There's some proteins in plasma, and then of course you have your blood cells, right, as well. But most of this is just going to be water. So ingesting more water is going to help you with that. The other issue that we want to think about is what we call osmometric thirst. This occurs through a different mechanism. And so this sort of line here, produced by increase in osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid relative to intracellular fluid. That probably doesn't make a lot of sense to anybody. What we mean by this is osmometric thirst occurs when your cells start losing fluid, so your cells start to dehydrate, and there's more pressure coming from the outside pushing in, right, rather than the inside pushing out. Okay, so your cells are getting dehydrated, they're going to shrivel. That's a different mechanism of thirst. There's a different brain region that's going to be responsible for recognizing this. We'll talk about those sort of mechanisms in a moment. That brain region is actually called the OVLT. Sydney, I don't anticipate that you're going to remember this long name, right? That long Latin name is probably going to be a waste of your time, but OVLT. Now this other guy, the subfornical organ, that's going to help detect hypovolemia, right? So those are the two brain regions that are going to be detecting whether or not you're losing body fluids. You lose these fluids, you drink some water, you activate that satiety mechanism. Interestingly, your anterior cingulate cortex is going to get involved in this, which is actually responsible for emotional processing, right? And how many of you have ever, after drinking some water because you were thirsty, it creates some positive feeling, right? I mean, you feel good about that, right? And you have some positive sort of response to that, some sort of emotional response, right? So that's kind of how this plays out, which is important. Drinking water should make you feel good because drinking water keeps you alive, right? So you see how that works. Things that keep you alive should feel good, so you're more likely to keep doing those. Just an idea. If drinking water felt bad, people would have stopped doing it a long time ago, right? And then they all would have died. So there you go. All right, so a little more about volumetric thirst. That's, again, produced by that hypovolemia, right, because you've lost blood volume. Okay. I'm not going to hit you up too much on this sort of hormone story, so I'm not going to expect you to memorize these. There are 2 or 3 steps here. I do want you to kind of keep in mind some of these basic principles, though. Now, if I wanted to measure the contents of my blood, where would be a great place to do that? Anybody have any ideas? It's kind of like right here. In case anybody wanted to take a wild guess, it's the kidneys, right? At any given moment, probably, I don't know, Jacqueline, probably 25% of your blood is going through your kidneys at any given moment, right? It's a pretty good chunk, right? So your kidneys are a great place to check the contents of your blood, right? And that's really all the kidneys do. Their main job is to filter extra things out of your blood, right? And send good, clean blood on, pull out any extra water that you don't need, pull out any extra sodium, right? As well as some of the nitrogenous wastes, particularly something known as urea, which is kind of how urine gets its name, that are the byproducts of cellular processes, right? How many of you have ever ingested urine? Nobody wants to raise their hand on that one, right? Urine is basically just hot salt water with a little bit of urea in there, right? And that's kind of what gives it that great odor, right? That's not true if you have sort of some other health problems, right? So how many of you have ever had a urinalysis? Lots of people have had urinalysis, right? They do this for different reasons. For some of you, it may be because somebody has decided to make sure you're not using performance-enhancing drugs, right? So you may have had to do that. For those of you that are student athletes. For the rest of you, it might have been to make sure you don't have diabetes, right? So that's a great way to check. You can do this at home, though. I would get like a small juice glass if I were you. They're easy to handle. That's why I suggest a juice glass. Anything bigger and you're just kind of running out of room, they're in your toilet. So if you just catch your urine, or you can ask somebody to help you, right? You can always ask somebody to help. A good thing for that's like a ladle. You kind of reach in there, catch what you need, and then pull it back out. If you give it a little sip, if you're Caroline, why'd you make that face? You just kind of made this like, was it the ladle or was it the urine? Because I never know. If you give it a little sip, if you have diabetes, it'll actually be a little sweet, right? And the reason for that is you're going to have an increase in the amount of glucose that's in your urine, right? Because people who are diabetic have elevated blood glucose levels. Where does that glucose go? It goes out through your kidneys and into your urine, right? So it's going to be salty and sweet. So you get a little sweet and salty there, right? It's a great combo. Now, if you are also someone who has high blood pressure, right, not only are you going to have like those things in there, but you're also going to have a little extra protein in there, right? So you can add a little, I mean, it's just like that's a perfect snack, right? You got a little salt, you got some carb, you got some protein in there. We could market this as a sports beverage, right? I mean, it's got all the things in there that you would want to put back into someone, right, as they're performing some athletic feat, right? We could call it something like Urade, right? I've even got a name for it, right? So the reason you have protein in your urine if you have high blood pressure, your kidneys have holes in the capillaries and such there, right? And that's how things come out. If your blood pressure is high, what happens, Austin, is it blows those holes open, right? The holes are bigger, and then things like albumin start falling out, right? And so those proteins in your plasma start falling out of those big holes. Now that creates a problem for a couple reasons. One of the main things that those proteins do in your blood is kind of make sure that hydrogen ions are in the right places, right? Which helps monitor and maintain your blood pH, right? So if you start losing a bunch of protein, your blood pH gets all screwed up, and that can really cause you, particularly acidosis, right? Which is when you basically turn your blood to acid, and it's going to rot out your pipes. So I would try to avoid that. So this is my, like, please don't go eat at McDonald's lecture, right? But I'm also going to tell you later, like, why McDonald's is so appealing, right? Because it is, right? How many of you are thinking about going to McDonald's on the way home now? Nobody. Like some of you, right? You guys are torn. You're like, well, he just told me not to, but then he's going to tell me like why I should, biologically. So I think that's sort of an interesting thing, and we'll discuss some health-related issues to that as we go. So, questions about that? That was a little bit of background I think you need to kind of understand this concept. Okay. So basically what happens when your blood volume drops, your kidney throws out a couple hormones, right, that help you. The end result is basically you're going to constrict blood vessels. You're going to retain sodium. When you retain those sodium ions, the water follows sodium, right? So wherever you put a sodium ion, water molecules are going to follow that. So if you retain that sodium rather than putting it out in your urine, then you're going to retain some extra volume in your blood. This is again why high sodium diets cause high blood pressure, right? Because the more sodium you have that you ingest, the more sodium that's going to be in your blood vessels, which means there's going to be more water in your blood vessels, which increases the pressure in your blood vessels, gives you high blood pressure and all those other great problems that come with that. Okay? So that's kind of the end story there. We can later see that your brain is going to look for this hormone, angiotensin, right? We've got a specific brain region that's going to monitor for that, because we know if that hormone is in your blood, then your kidneys have said blood volume is low, we need to ingest water, right? And so what we'll do then, brain region is going to detect this hormone, and then it's going to activate drinking, and that's sort of the process. You don't have to worry too much about this. This is just showing you how you might lose water. You guys know how you might lose water. Now, that's for volumetric thirst. If we want to think about osmometric thirst, we have to have what are called osmoreceptors. These are going to be neurons that are sensitive to stretch, right? And so if you are a little bit shriveled, that means, hey, there's not enough water to fill me up. So we can send a signal to your brain that says you need to start drinking. Okay. If there's a lot of water and your cell is nice and full and plump, then we can say, hey, we're satiated, we don't need more water, stop drinking. Okay. Don't worry about those slides. Now, this is kind of important, and I'm surprised all of you, and I'm disappointed, in fact, in all of you, that someone hasn't asked this brilliant question. How does the brain know what's in your blood? Because who remembers the time we talked about the blood-brain barrier? Yeah. And what did we say about that, Jacqueline? It's a barrier between the blood and the brain, right? I mean, it's all right in the name, what we said about it, right? So it's just right there. So the blood-brain barrier typically prevents things in your blood from getting into your brain. That's why we had to have those astrocytes, remember? To pluck out glucose, right? So your brain could have that energy source, right? Well, we talked before about an area called the area postrema, and we said that actually is an area where there's a weak blood-brain barrier, and if you ingest something that is toxic, it will make you projectile vomit, right? Okay, so that was fun. There are actually two other important, what we call circumventricular organs, organs where there is a weak or absent blood-brain barrier, that are important to thirst, right? And again, if we want the brain to measure something that's in the blood, we need to get rid of the blood-brain barrier there, right? And those two regions, I know it's a real shock, are the OVLT, which is going to measure osmometric thirst, and the subfornical organ, which is going to measure volumetric thirst, right? So we have these two regions that bypass the blood-brain barrier, so they are exposed directly to the blood, and they can tell us if the blood is, if there are things in the blood that would indicate to us that we need to ingest water. Both of them are going to send signals to something called the median preoptic nucleus. Now this is median with an N. A couple weeks ago we talked about the medial preoptic nucleus, which we said was important for male sexual behavior, right? So I don't want you to confuse these two brain regions. But the median preoptic nucleus, now this guy is behind the blood-brain barrier, so it's protected, but it's going to initiate drinking behavior, okay? So whether the subfornical organ or the OVLT sends a signal to the median preoptic nucleus, the end result is the same. That end result is drinking. Because it doesn't really matter, Seth, why we're thirsty. The result is the same, right? Or the action to remedy that's the same, and that's drinking water, okay? Doesn't matter if you're thirsty because you don't have enough blood volume. It doesn't matter if you're thirsty because your cells are getting dehydrated. The solution is just to drink water. So that's what we'll do. Now, this angiotensin, it actually does not cross the blood-brain barrier itself, and again, that's why we would need that particular, that weak spot in the blood-brain barrier. So I think this diagram is actually really nice. I think this diagram really summarizes pretty simply these mechanisms of thirst, right? Now, this is your blood-brain barrier, these two red spaces. Just imagine, though, that they continue on, right? Sort of, and everything above or below that is completely encased by the blood-brain barrier, or, completely outside the blood-brain barrier. And what's inside here, in this case the median preoptic nucleus, as well as the rest of your brain, is going to be protected by that blood-brain barrier. Again, your subfornical organ is going to measure angiotensin 2, right, which is that hormone we talked about from the kidneys, that the kidneys are going to release when your blood volume gets too low. Okay? So when the subfornical organ notices this hormone coming through, it says, hey, it's probably time to signal to the median preoptic nucleus that we should start drinking water. So we do. The OVLT actually starts looking at solute concentration of the blood, right? And so as solute concentration of the blood changes, that's going to be an indicator of osmometric thirst. Okay? And when those osmoreceptors in the OVLT are triggered, they'll send a signal again to that median preoptic nucleus, which Rebecca just does the exact same thing, right? It's just time to drink. It's pretty simple, but I think it's actually a pretty elegant mechanism here. Either way that you're going to be thirsty, we've got you covered. It's pretty cool, right? Any questions about drinking? Because, Rodney, we're getting ready to switch gears and start talking about eating. So I just want to make sure everybody's cool on the drinking side. All right. No questions at all.
Maybe a question. Okay.
Maybe a question. Is it also maybe a statement? We'll see.
So, if you have diabetes and normally you're really thirsty, what is it that causes you to be more thirsty if you're diabetic?
Right. So you've got a lot of problems going on if you're diabetic. But one thing you could quickly think about is, we already said glucose levels are going to be higher, right? And so if glucose levels are higher in your blood, then that solute concentration is going to be higher, right? Which is going to make you think, I've got too much stuff in my blood and not enough water to dilute that, and so that can make you thirsty, right? So that's one thing that can sort of activate that mechanism. Also, what goes hand in hand with diabetes sometimes? High blood pressure, right? That's pretty common. So you've got sort of other mechanisms going on as well, where you might be retaining other things that could cause your kidneys to perhaps indicate that you're thirsty as well. If you can, avoid diabetes. That's like an obvious statement, right? For some people you can't. Some people you can do what you can to fight it off, but it's a tough one. High blood pressure too. Avoid that at all costs. No, seriously, like even slightly elevated blood pressure, younger can cause you problems as you get older, right? Because it's that continued sort of pressure on those, what we call fenestrations in your kidneys, right? So that continued, even if it's not really high, if it's just a little bit high, you're constantly kind of like pushing at those windows, and they just get a little bigger each time, right? So how many of you have ever had like a, maybe like a blanket or a shirt that had a hole in it? You kept like sticking your finger through it, right? And it wasn't, right, Jacqueline? And it wasn't really like a big deal sticking your finger through the first, and you stick it again, the next thing you know, like your whole arm's going in, right? And each time you did it, it really wasn't that much. It wasn't like you tried to like jam your whole arm in one time, right? You just kind of a little bit at a time, just kind of like poke, and then eventually, you've got this giant hole. And blood pressure works the same way. Right, it's just like a little bit at a time, constantly. So if you're like in your 20s or 30s and you've got high blood pressure, even if it's just slightly elevated, then over the next couple decades, and it keeps doing that, and it keeps doing that, and it keeps doing that, right? And then the next thing you know, Rodney, you got high blood pressure, and you got serious problems, and you got that, protein-filled urine, right? You're selling as a sports drink. So I wouldn't recommend that as a money-making, like, hey, I'm going to try to get the high blood pressure and diabetes at the same time. And then I'm going to market my urine as a great sports product. You guys want to hear a great story about running? Yeah. How many of you like to run? How many of you just run anyway? Yeah. You may not like to run, but you run for some other reason, right? And I don't mean because like somebody's chasing you. Like that's an obvious reason to run. But I'm thinking like, maybe you run because you get some financial benefit from that, right? That happens for some people. You might not think of that as a financial benefit right now, but for those, like you had to pay your tuition, that's a different story, right? So there's a financial benefit. So running, so how many of you preload, how many of you exercise on a regular basis, right? Don't be embarrassed if you don't raise your hand, that's fine. But you should exercise on a regular basis. I also recommend before you exercise, now there are like a couple of you who might say that's a bad idea, because I told my other class about this, and someone in there said, oh no, I would never do that. And I was like, oh, you should anyway. It's like you're never going to win, but you should do that. Before you actually go out and like start running or exercising, you should preload some water, right? And typically they recommend like preloading like a quart of water before you go out and do some strenuous. And what I mean by preload is just like drink a quart of water before you go out and exercise, because you're going to lose a bunch of water. And then remember those like mechanisms that tell you you're thirsty take a little bit of time, and then you actually drinking the water takes a little bit of time to like get those cells rehydrated, right? And so there's like some delay, but if you put a little extra water in the beginning, by the time your cells start to get dehydrated, that water is being delivered, right? So it's actually kind of smart to preload and have a little water on the front end. Now, someone in my other class, Adriana, runs long distances, and yeah, and she said that preloading a quart of water before she would run would be a bad idea. She thought it would make her sick. Huh? Yeah, it is a good bit of water, right? It really is. And she said she thought that would make her sick. And then I told her this great story about this guy named Bernd Heinrich. You guys might be interested in this guy, Bernd Heinrich. I don't know if you know Bernd Heinrich or not. He's quite old now. He's got a really interesting story. He wrote a book called Why We Run, which is a great book for even those of you who don't like to run or don't ever run. Basically, this guy has a PhD in physiology, right? So he's a biologist, but he's also an ultra marathoner, right? And he didn't start out as an ultra marathoner. He just was 45 years old and says, "Hey, I think I'm going to run an ultra marathon." It's a crazy thing to say, and so he did. But this book is great. The beginning part of the book, if you do buy it, is a little weird. And you're thinking, like, did I buy the right book? Because I had this thought. He starts actually telling the story. His family, when he was younger, they actually fled the Nazi invasion in Poland, I believe it was. And so they had to flee when the Nazis were invading. They had to hide in the woods. Like, they lived in this house and they hid in the woods for a long time. It's like a crazy story, right? And he used to like run up and down this road to get to this house, and he would like watch moths fly and all kinds of things. Then his parents and his family, he's got a sister, they finally make it out, and they get to the United States. His family basically dumps him and his sister at an orphanage in Maine while they go to Africa to collect bird specimens for like natural history museums. So I know it's like this crazy story. Then he ends up going to college at one of the University of Maine campuses. That's got a different name now than it had then. He was on their track team, and so he would run like sort of middle distances, right? He wouldn't run, it wasn't like, the mile, but also wasn't like 50 miles. So he would run these distances. He was actually quite good. And so he did that, went on, got his PhD. As I said, when he was in his 40s, he decided he was going to start running ultra marathons, which are things like 50 miles and beyond, right? These are like long distances. In fact, for a while, and he may still hold the record, he had the record for the longest distance that anybody had ever ran in 24 hours, like a 24-hour period. He ran like 156 miles in 24 hours. Right, I know it's kind of impressive, right, so that he can do this. Now, for those of you that are interested in ultra marathons, for those of you that are not interested in ultra marathons, I'm going to tell you a reason why you should possibly get into this. If you're running that long of a distance, you need to ingest something other than just water, right? Because your body will run out of energy. And so often people will ingest liquids that contain a lot of carbohydrates, right? So can any of you think of an interesting liquid that contains a lot of carbohydrates? It's beer. So sometimes these guys will drink beer while they're, I know, right? So you're going to run 100 miles and drink beer while you're doing it. Seems like a great combination. So might get some more of you interested in running, right? So they'll drink beer while they're running, which I know, right, Jacob? I mean, you're thinking like, if I'm going to do a race, there's like kegs periodically, and they just give you like a little cup of beer, and so you just take off. Bernd Heinrich had this idea, like, hey, beer's good, but there are some problems with beer, obviously, right? So maybe I'm going to try something else. So he had this bright idea when he ran one of these races. He was going to try cranberry juice. Already you know why that's funny, for those of you that have ingested any amount of cranberry juice. One of the number one, I mean, why do they tell you to drink cranberry juice? It's great for sort of cleaning out your kidneys and other urinary apparatus, right? And that's because it makes you urinate, right? It's definitely a diuretic, so it's going to make you flush everything out, right? A lot of folks, for those of you that have shorter urethras than some other folks, will often ingest, in case you don't know, the urethra is the outspout, right? And in like half of the population, it's sort of one length, and in the other half, it's like a tenth of that length, right? For those of you that have a shorter urethra, you might consider periodically drinking some cranberry juice just to get things flushed out, so you don't have to worry about urinary tract infections, right? Okay, which is a common sort of preventative, right? For females, they'll often ingest some cranberry juice for that, right? So he said, I'm going to drink cranberry juice. The first race, surprisingly, he didn't have any problems, which is really amazing, right? And so Ocean Spray actually sponsored him for this race. The next race that he went in, he lost like 15 minutes on his race time because he had to stop and pee so many times because he kept drinking cranberry juice. I just think that's hilarious. But cranberry juice does have a lot of carbohydrates. It's got a lot of sugar in it, right? So it can kind of give you those extra nutrients that you need for a longer distance. So there you go. I don't know if anybody found that interesting. I thought it was a great drinking story. And I think it kind of highlights a few things and tells you guys something interesting that you should think about, right? How many of you are going to get into racing now? Like, no, nobody's going to. No, the beer didn't do it for you. So there you go. I don't know. I thought it was interesting. You should pick up the book. It's a good book. He actually studied moths and how they flap their wings and thermoregulate. You know, insects thermoregulate. So he was thinking about like how he needed to like move his upper body and his cadence, right? So that he could figure out. And he experimented with all these cadences, right? So he would try like, you know, 3 steps for 1 breath in and like 2 steps for 1 breath out, and that doesn't really work. So he tried all of these other sort of things to like adjust his breathing, because when you're running, if you're doing like a short sprint, that's a completely different set of mechanisms than if you're running even like a 5K versus 50 miles, right? And so there are different things that you have to do. He studied frog legs, the way frog legs move, to think about ways that he could reduce drag while he's running. And so he tried to like, because you have to be energy efficient to run like 100 miles, right? It's not about like how fast can I run 100 miles. Largely it's like, can I run 100 miles, right? And so it's a different sort of thing, Morgan. And so he was like studying like how he would like change the way he would run. So he would like run in his neighborhood with like cranberry juice, like doing weird things. It's a good book. It's a good book, and especially if you are a runner, you know, there's some things in there that might be helpful for you. All right. So let's think about eating, right? It seems exciting. Did anybody have any questions about that? No? Okay, great. What I think is interesting is that you are literally, Sydney, what you eat. It's straightforward. Whatever you eat, you take those molecules and turn them into your body, right? You use them to sort of maintain and construct your own organs, right? So there's maintenance that we have to do on all of our organs, bones, muscles, liver, heart, whatever. And so we're constantly incorporating molecules that we ingest into those. So if you eat donuts, guess what? You are made of donuts, right? Because you take those donuts, you break them down, you use those pieces to kind of make your body. You also use the energy from the food that you ingest, right? So that you can move your muscles and you can stay warm, right? Which is kind of fascinating. So, as I like to say, quite literally, you are what you eat, right? So that's kind of fun. In order to stay alive, this is a real shocker, so write this down. You have to have fuel for your cells and oxygen. So basically, you need to eat and you need to breathe, okay? So I think we just solved that problem of death, right? As long as you're eating and breathing, you'll stay alive. So just keep doing those two things. If you stop one or the other, you're going to die. Okay? Nobody thought about that, right? Living forever is that simple. Just keep breathing and eating. You have to do those two things. So we know where the oxygen comes from. Where does the fuel come from? Mostly it comes from our digestive tract, right? And how does it get there? Well, you put it there. You put food into your digestive tract, and we started sucking nutrients out of that, right? It's that simple. How do you put food into your digestive system? Most people do it just through like normal eating. There are other ways you can get stuff there, right? Obviously, like feeding tubes or other things. We're going to think about sort of the normal, like I'm going to move my jaw up and down and, you know, rip off pieces of a cheeseburger and then swallow those, right? So there you go. Now, similarly to drinking, we're not constantly eating, right? But we are constantly using energy, right? Even when you're asleep, you're using energy. And how do you know this? You're still breathing when you're asleep, and your heart's still pumping, right? And your body is repairing organs and doing things while you sleep. So you still have a lot of metabolic activity, right? How many of you know about basal metabolic rate, your BMR? So like even if you just lie in your bed all day, you're going to burn calories, right? You have to burn a certain amount of calories just to keep your body processes going, right? Now it's not a great weight loss strategy to just stay in bed all day, right? Because you would have to couple that with like a massive reduction in food intake, but you're still going to burn calories just breathing and your heart beating, right? So that burns some calories. So we're constantly burning calories, but we're not constantly putting calories in, right? We put calories in, you know what, 2 or 3, 4, 5 times a day, right? I think most people eat between 2 and 6 times a day. That's probably a reasonable range. Some people maybe more often than that. Some people maybe less. Sort of depends. I'm going to imagine most of you eat 2 to 5 times a day, right? It's not going to be anybody that's too much of an outlier on that. Some of you might eat more often if you're on a particular sort of regimen, but I doubt anybody's eating any less than twice a day on average. Some days you may go and it's like, oh man, what happened to breakfast and lunch? I better eat something now. Those are days I think that probably have happened a lot recently to you. The reason I think this is because I watched the news and I've recognized that there have been 2 major video game releases recently, right? So I don't know how many of you are losing time to Red Dead Redemption 2 and Fallout 76, right? I think that's taken a lot of, right, Sammy? Is that taking a lot of people's time? No con. Huh? You've heard, right? Yeah, you've heard on the street that people are losing sleep to that. That's okay. At least they shut off the beta server for Fallout, right, Seth? So you're not going to play it after a certain time period. You don't know about that. That's okay. Or you've got that guilty smile on your face, like you do know.
I know about it.
There you go. That's fine. So we're not going to constantly be eating. We're going to store things. We do have some long-term and some short-term reservoirs. Anybody know like some places where you might store energy and nutrients in your body? Really, there are only like 2 or 3 places, right? We want to think about adipose tissue, muscles, and liver, right? Those are sort of the only places where you're going to store energy. We'll pull off of those as we need. Now, we ingest some glucose. Why do we need glucose? Why do we need food or energy in the form of glucose? We use glucose for things like the Krebs cycle, right? You guys familiar with the Krebs cycle? Some of you are. That's a blast, right? Cynthia, you look like you're in some pain. Yeah, the Krebs cycle's not a lot of fun, right? I'm not going to make you draw that. So you need glucose. In particular, your brain runs exclusively on glucose, right? It doesn't run on anything else. So your brain has to have glucose, right? This is one of the reasons why sugary foods are so wonderful, right? How many of you love sugary foods? The correct answer, Taylor, is everyone, right? And anybody who tells you otherwise is lying, or they have some problem and they have like a brain injury, right? Because everyone loves sugar. You are evolved to love sugar because you need glucose to run your brain. It's that simple, right? Now, millennia ago, even a few centuries ago, this wasn't a major problem, right? You loved sugar. Who cares? The sweetest thing you could get your hands on were some blueberries, right? And if a handful of blueberries is the most sugar-packed thing you can get, you're probably not going to run into any health problems, right? You're probably not going to develop diabetes from that, and you're probably, I would say probably not going to have any problems with your teeth, but you also didn't have toothbrushes, so it's kind of a competing issue there. But assuming you had a toothbrush, everyone would be cavity-free, right? Because blueberries don't have, the huge amount of sugar in them that we would see for something like vanilla ice cream, chocolate ice cream. They also make that strawberry ice cream. They make some other flavors. What are some other sugary things that people eat? We're getting near that sort of holiday time, right? You guys might see some pumpkin pies. Who's a red velvet cake fan? Anybody? Yeah. So my grandmother, who's dead, which doesn't narrow it down because they both are. At first I thought, well, that's going to just tell you which grandmother, but they're both dead, so that doesn't help. So whatever, Taylor, right? So we used to get red velvet cake at Thanksgiving and Christmas, right, which was really nice. However, when my grandmother would make the red velvet cake, you would see like all of the red layers of cake, and then even at the top you could see that it was red, and there was just like a little bit of icing at the top, right? And for those of you that have had a red velvet cake, normally you realize that's not how they're supposed to look. We weren't aware of this until after my grandmother was diagnosed with diabetes. And then the following Thanksgiving, Jacob, we had a cake that was covered in icing, and we thought that was kind of weird. Apparently what she had been doing was eating all of the icing. I know, right? She had apparently been eating all of the icing that was supposed to go on the cake, and all that was left was like a little dollop that went on top. And so for years, that's all we ever had. And we thought, well, that's a red velvet cake right there, not realizing it should have been completely covered in icing. And then that's how we started getting them, sort of later. It's an interesting story there, right? I mean, it's got everything you want. Red velvet cakes, grandmothers, and diabetes. It's a perfect story. She also once had to go to the hospital because she ate too much chocolate and had to have her stomach pumped. But that's a whole separate story. I know, right, Taylor? Yeah, and so you'd go over to her house and she would always have little Debbie cakes. Why? I don't know. She's like, oh, I just buy them because you might come over and visit. And I was like, well, why are there 8 empty boxes in the trash can? She's like, well, you know, you just never know. It's kind of interesting. I don't know. I don't think she ate much else. I think she just ate chocolate. So there you go. So glucose, you love glucose. You're going to eat things that contain glucose. If you don't need it right now, that's awesome. This guy called insulin, you guys have heard of insulin, will take the glucose and turn it into something called glycogen. And basically what it does is it takes a little glucose and snaps it together with a bunch of other little glucoses and makes like a long branching chain of glycogen. Later, when you need that glucose, this guy called glucagon comes over and just clips off these little glucoses, and then you can use those to generate ATP, right? So you can use those for what you need. You can see why this can be a problem, right? So what's one thing that we give folks who are diabetic? Insulin, right? And you would give them insulin because if their blood glucose level is too high, if you give them insulin, they'll start converting that into that long-term storage molecule, right? Okay, into that glycogen. So that's pretty cool, right? You guys learned something today. So we know why sugary things are good. What about fatty things? Anybody know why cheeseburgers are so wonderful? Cheeseburgers are like the ultimate meal, right? Like if you were going to eat something, the cheeseburger is the way to go, right? Because it's the perfect combination of proteins and fats and carbohydrates. You've got everything you need right there in this like hand-sized package, right? Which is just brilliant. So cheeseburgers will cause you a lot of problems, though, right? If that's all you eat. And they're okay, you know, like once in a while. I wouldn't recommend them every day. But fats are really tempting to us because when you're looking at the different types of foods you can eat, right, the different foodstuffs, the different nutrients, there's more energy per gram in fats than in your other foods, right? And so you're going to naturally want to eat things that are very energy rich, right? Now, in today's world, that's not too much of a problem. Or, I mean, it is a problem because obtaining food is not too much of a problem. So I'm going to make a bit of an assumption about you. And if it's not true, I don't mean to, like, gloss over things about, like, hunger, right? But if you are, I should make a side note, like, if you are dealing with, like, food insecurity issues, we actually somewhere have a food pantry. Anybody know where that is? It used to be in the student center, and then they moved it somewhere off campus, I think at a church. I don't really know. We can figure that out for you if you need to. Ask somebody. So there are things available. But I'm going to assume most of you can go home right now, and there are many choices for you in your refrigerator for food, right? That's the case for a lot of folks, okay? Again, I'm not, there are a number of people, obviously, who are food insecure, and I want to make light of that. But for the most part, people have ready access to food, okay? And we have ready access to foods that are packed with calories and with energy, right? And these fatty foods, okay? This was not a problem in the past when the fattiest thing you could get your hands on was a rabbit that you had to chase down, right? And you can see why chasing down a rabbit and then eating it is not going to be something that's going to cause you to develop any health issues related to your food intake, right? But now, when I can go to my freezer or I can just walk down campus to Fat Patty's on the way to my car, and I do that every day, right? You know, so like 5 days a week, I'm walking right by Fat Patty's. 5 days a week, I could stop in twice, right? Because I walk by there twice a day, kind of here and there. I could have 2 cheeseburgers every day, right? If I wanted. And you can see where that could be a problem because that food is accessible to me all the time, right? If that food was not accessible to me all the time, then that would be a different story. And it doesn't get any better if you go the other directions, right? It's because you have like these other sort of not healthy options, right? And so food is readily accessible to you. If you're really in the need for something, you know, there's like a vending machine right out there, right? So we make all of these things so easy for you to access, right? And a lot of people have just $1, right? Anybody that's got $1 can go buy some chocolate, right? So there's not like a high threshold for that. So again, that's why I think one of the many reasons we're starting to see more health issues related to food intake, not just how much food, but the types of food that we eat, right? So there you go. Also, you got to watch out for gout. Anybody had gout? You don't want gout. I've been avoiding gout for decades. Just to let you know, Taylor. Gout is used to be called like a rich man's disease because it came from eating foods that are high in a particular molecule. Those foods tend to be like meats and shellfishes, right? And so if you were obviously a poor person, a few centuries ago, you weren't really eating a lot of meat. You weren't eating a lot of shellfish, right? You don't really hear about the poverty-stricken and all the oysters they eat, right? So it's not really a problem. But it's if you eat these sort of rich foods all the time, and I mean rich in this particular molecule, you'll actually start to create crystal shards in your joints. And basically it's like you have glass in your joints, and it's very painful. Ham. It happens. Yeah, some people are more prone to it than others, depending on how well they can break down some of the foods that they eat, some of the specific molecules.
If you normally use like fried chicken nuggets and like stuff like that all the time, like he makes them a whole so he has to come like eat something like crap.
Yeah, I mean it. Yeah, I mean. Well, there you go.
You know those people that like salad over rabbits, and that's rabbit food.
Yeah.
And those go through.
Yeah, so he has gout. Makes sense, right? That's what happens. I'm going to take a guess he's also got high blood pressure.
Oh, sure.
It's like the other guess I'm going to take, right? So, again, I shouldn't diagnose someone from a distance, right? That's what I was told today. Not that I try to diagnose people. Somebody else was trying to diagnose Elon Musk and some of his mental health problems. You guys know Elon Musk? He's the Tesla guy. Yeah, he's got some things going on up there, right, that aren't exactly right. Like some days you think, man, that guy's okay, and then some days you think, what is he doing? It's like, I don't know. So there you go. All right, so any questions about that? No. I mean, the problem is, and we'll talk about this a bit later when we talk about, one of the major health problems facing our country and some other places too is obesity, right? So that's an issue. Our species has not evolved nearly as quickly as our society evolved, right? And particularly in the way that we provide food to our society, and so we can talk about that some as we get later into the lecture. All right, so you've got sort of two phases. Your fasting phase basically means you don't have food in your digestive system, which is fine. I mean, that's probably most of you right now. The exception would be if some of you ate right before you came to class. You probably still have some food working your way from the stomach into the small intestine, right? Usually once you eat, food stays in your stomach a couple hours, and then it kind of moves into the rest of your digestive system, and you're pulling nutrients out as that's going. The absorptive phase is when you do have food in that digestive system and you're absorbing those nutrients, right? So fasting phase, if you're using nutrients, it's coming from long or short-term storage. Absorptive phase, you're pulling things out of your food. Most of the time, it takes 24 to 48 hours for food to go, start to finish. There are ways that you can figure this out if you kind of want to track your digestive system, right? I know, Cynthia, you're like, well, how could I do that? Well, the easiest way to do this is to ingest a food that doesn't really go through much transformation while it's in your digestive system, and then you can write down when you saw it the first time, and then you can write down when you see it the second time. And the time in between there is how fast your digestive system works, right? Those are called marker foods. The number one marker food is corn, right? So like whole kernel corn. If you were to ingest some of that now, and then you just write down the next time you see that whole kernel corn, outside of your body, then you'll know exactly how long your digestive system takes to process things. For most folks, 24 to 48 hours. Some people a little faster, some people a little slower, just depends, right? Questions about that? How many of you are going home to buy corn? Nobody? Anybody interested? Actually, so as a side note, you actually probably should know how long it takes food to go through your digestive system. Jacqueline, this is really great to determine if you're sick, right? And so when you start noticing sort of some changes in, how things are coming and going, then you can start to think about potential health problems that are coming on, right? You guys need to know about your bodies. Yeah, there's some other things I was going to say, but I don't think I will, because I know how Taylor, some of you will take it. So we're just going to move on. Hey, this is an awesome diagram. Basically showing you some stuff I was talking about earlier, where you have glucose, fat, and amino acids, right? And so these are coming from the digestive system. Again, all that glucose is going to energy. Any of the fat is going to be stored up in adipose tissue. Your amino acids and some glucose will also be going to your muscles, rest of your body. The amino acids are going there for protein synthesis. The glucose is going for energy. Anybody here on a vegan or vegetarian diet? You don't have to answer this, but some people are. Great. If you decide to do that, I would recommend that you do some research on that, right, to make sure you do things properly, because some of the nutrients that you need will not come from some of the foods that you're going to eat. Particularly, there are some amino acids that don't come from certain plant sources, right? So you have to think about ways to be creative to get those, which is fine. Anybody on a non-vegetarian or non-vegan diet? Yeah, that's probably the rest of you. I would recommend you do a little bit of research on that too before you continue with that diet. Just in general, I'd recommend you put some research into the food that you eat, right? Just to make sure you're doing things the right way, because there's a lot of options out there for you, right? And what's nice is actually we're getting better and better at offering sort of nice options for you. Now, I'm not one of these people who's like, oh yeah, definitely jump on that paleo diet. That's brilliant. Because I'm not actually convinced those people spend a lot of time thinking about that. They're like, oh man, if I was a caveman, I bet I would eat a bunch of raw and fermented nuts. And I'm not sure that they really put a lot of thought into it other than that, right? And so then they sell you these things that are overpriced. Right? And so everybody goes on these phases and these fads. And so I think the thing you should do is really just put a lot of research into it. Think about the things you should eat. Have a variety of food sources, right? Don't eat the same thing all the time, like chicken nuggets. Chicken nuggets once in a while are probably okay, right? But don't eat chicken nuggets all the time. I know this guy who ate chicken and sweet potatoes every day, 3 times a day, every day. Yeah, no, I thought about that for a while. So, I don't know.
That's weird because I used to make a lady chicken and sweet potato fries every single day for 3 of her meals every single day. I swear to God, she how many good were.
Yeah. I mean, I like chicken and sweet potatoes. It is. But lots of folks will do that, for different reasons. Extra food that you don't need, again, we store that, some of these extra substances later when you're not ingesting food and you need that energy. What you will do is you will pull off items from that storage, whether that's in your stomach, in your liver, or in adipose tissue, convert it to glucose if you need to, or go ahead and just send it on down to your muscles, because those fatty acids can be used as well for energy. Questions about that? It's not so bad, right? Hey, here's the cool guy. Its name is ghrelin. This is a hormone. It's released by your stomach, and it tells you that it's time to eat, right? Makes you feel hungry. Okay? It's also produced in the brain. Now, what I think is really interesting about ghrelin, so again, it comes out of your stomach, it can travel up to your brain, to your hypothalamus. Once it gets to your hypothalamus, it signals that you're hungry, and you start ingesting food. Now, if you look at this sort of graph, and what we're doing here is we're charting out changes in ghrelin levels in your blood throughout the day. What you see is a steep drop in ghrelin levels after every single meal, right? So ghrelin is released when your stomach is empty. You stop releasing ghrelin when your stomach is full. That's a good indicator to know if you're hungry, right? If your stomach's full, you shouldn't be hungry, right? Because you have plenty of food. What I think is really interesting about this is this nice little uptick in ghrelin late in the day, right, as you're getting in, trying to go to sleep. So how many of you have ever been told, if you want to lose weight, stop eating at night? Okay, well, that's slightly ill-informed advice, but there you go. There are many other ways you can lose weight, and eating late at night isn't necessarily the culprit, right? There are certain things you can eat at certain times, and it's a little bit more of a nuanced story than just don't eat at night. Secondly, how many of you have ever tried to go to sleep while you were hungry? It's not really easy, is it? No, because what do you want to do? Eat, right? And we talked about this when we talked about things that keep you awake, right? And we said hunger was one of those. Because what can happen if you fall asleep hungry? Well, you can die in your sleep, right? You're going to be asleep and you're going to run out of nutrients and you're going to go, well, I guess I got to stop using my heart for a while. We'll shut that off. And then you don't wake up. So that can happen. So this is why I always try to eat, like a cheeseburger right before I go to sleep. Or just start sleeping with a cheeseburger, just in case you wake up and you're hungry. It gets a little cold, and sometimes you get grease stains on your pillows, but we'll just start buying darker pillows. It'll work. You just wake up smelling like onions. I don't know. Nobody thinks that's a good idea, right? I don't know. Sammy seems like he's buying in on this. He's like, maybe a cheeseburger. I don't know. Could be good luck for you, right? Put a cheeseburger under your pillow before a match. Wake up the next day. Maybe you score a bunch of goals. We'll see, right? Give it a try. It can't hurt, I guess. Nobody thinks I have great ideas. Why is that? These are brilliant. Well, what are you going to do? Some other signals that might say, hey, I'm hungry. If you start losing out on glucose, you start losing out on fats, you'll start to eat as well. You have detectors in your liver, right, that say, hey, I've got glucose or I don't have glucose. I've got fats or I don't have fats, right? And so they can, those can start to signal your brain that you need to start eating as well once those nutrients get low. Your brain actually has glucose detectors, but nothing for fat, right? Doesn't have any fats. And you do need to eat some fats, right? Like if you did not eat any fats at all, that probably would not work very well, right? You have to have a nice balance of nutrients to kind of maintain, positive life. Questions about that? All right, everybody write this down. This is going to tell you how to regulate your body weight. You have to balance your food intake with your energy expenditure. I know. Nobody saw that one coming. We started a great weight management program. It's called Eat As Much As You Do. And that's the trick, right? If you eat more than you do, then you gain weight. If you do more than you eat, then you lose weight. If both things are equal, your weight stays the same. That's a lot more difficult than it sounds, right? For any of you who have tried to gain or lose weight, it can be a difficult thing to do because you have to make other adjustments, right, to your life, either behaviorally. Well, they're all behavior, right? I mean, what you eat and what you do are behavioral sort of modifications. It's kind of interesting. Part of the problem with eating is you can't just stop, right? You can't just stop eating, which is bad. So you have to keep eating. But if you have a problem where you tend to overeat, you can't live without eating, right? If you've got a problem where you use too much cocaine, I mean, you can just stop using cocaine altogether, right? No, seriously, right? And so you can just stop using cocaine and you'll still be alive, right? You do not need cocaine to live. That's a true story. However, you do need food to live, right? And so if your problem is not overusing cocaine, but overusing cheeseburgers, then that becomes a little bit more difficult to manage, right? So there are some problems. So there you go. Not a big deal. What about memory? Well, there are some sort of, and this is actually sort of very timely considering we're approaching sort of the holiday season, right? How many of you are looking forward to going home or doing whatever it is you do for your sort of holiday celebrations, and some of that centers around food? Right? Yeah, how many of you are looking forward to like pecan pies? Nobody's a pecan pie. Pumpkin pie. There we go. Is that better? Pumpkin pie. I don't really like pumpkin pie. My mother makes, this is sort of an odd food for holidays. It's the only time I can guilt her into making it, though, is baklava. So she makes baklava for me, right? Which is just such a labor-intensive thing. I can't get it any other time of the year. So I have to convince her, like, hey, like right now would be a great time, because she has to take like each sheet of dough, right? And I don't even know how she does it because I've intentionally avoided not knowing, Because as soon as I learn how to do it, she'll tell me to do it, right? But if I don't know how to do it, she'll keep making it for me. It's like some honey and butter she puts on there, and like she does something with these nuts on the bottom. I don't know. And then she cuts them into triangles. And then I bring a whole pan home. And you have to eat it. For those of you that don't know, you have to eat it within 2 days or it'll go bad. So you just have to eat it then. And that's why I never share it. So good luck on that. Actually, my parents are going to be out of town for Thanksgiving. I'm a little disappointed. I'm going to have to try to get her to make something for me. Maybe I can use that to get 2 pans some other time. I'm really trying to think about how to guilt her into this. No, they decided this year they were going to go down to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and volunteer. Why would they volunteer to do something nice? They're going to go clean up the park. Like they're going to pick up like trash. I know, right? I mean, Taylor, what?
On Thanksgiving.
On Thanksgiving, right? I mean, why would you do that? Clearly, I didn't get those genetics.
Like Black Friday.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, so I'm gonna.
Really wholesome. That just sounds like a Mr. Rogers episode. Like, I'm so thankful for the environment.
Yeah, I know, right? Like, wow. Yeah, it's kind of impressive, I guess, right? They're gonna go volunteer to clean up a national park. What are you guys doing for Thanksgiving? Nothing that great. So there you go. A couple old people are beating you guys out. They're both in their 60s now. My mom just turned 60 Monday, so yeah. So there you go, right? 2 60-plus-year-olds are doing more awesome things than you guys. You should feel bad about that, right? I don't know. I don't feel that bad about it, but I got other things I got to do that week. Still, it's pretty cool. So anyway, probably not getting anything great then, but hopefully, at Christmas maybe I'll get double. So, hoping for it. We'll see. But there's some memory components, right? Some sort of, you might call that nostalgia, but there's some positive element to eating, right? And so you think about that, and you're like, well, that was a great experience, that time I ate whatever it was, and so you kind of look forward to that and anticipate that. There are other sensory factors that might sort of make you hungry, right? How many of you have not been hungry, and then you walk down the street and some food odor wafts out of a restaurant, and you go like, you know what I've been wanting? A fish sandwich. And you go in and you eat something, right? It happens all the time. They know this. This is actually a cool story. There's this molecule called CCK. It's a hormone. How many hormones have we talked about now? Like 50, right? But CCK is kind of cool. And your small intestine will release this if there are fats present, right? And it makes you think you're full, right? So that's great. There's also this guy called peptide YY. Similar story here. If you've got nutrients in the small intestine, you're going to release this hormone. You say, hey, I'm full, I can stop eating. Now, there was an interesting story a few years ago with CCK. They actually had some rats where they blocked CCK production. And so what you might predict is these rats would overeat and they would gain weight compared to control rats, right? And that makes sense, right? If we're blocking a mechanism that says you're full, then you're just going to keep eating, right? And so if you keep eating, you would gain weight, and that's what you would anticipate. The interesting thing about this is what they noticed with these rats is they actually didn't gain weight, right? So even though they weren't getting this signal that they were full, the rats didn't gain weight. And that was a real shock to these experimenters. So then they would kind of like sit and watch these rats and try to like figure out, hey, what's going on? And then they started noticing something. These rats were spending more time on their running wheels than the rats who had normal CCK signaling. So to compensate for eating more, they were doing more. So they would get on the wheel and they would run, and that would help maintain their body weight. When they took the wheels away, the rats gained weight because they were continuing to eat at that higher level, and they didn't have a way to increase their activity levels. So there you go. So that's kind of cool, right? How many of you go to the gym simply to eat pizza? And I don't mean eat the pizza at the gym, right? No, nobody does that. That's just me. That's the reason I go, Taylor. It's just so I can have pizza and some beer, right? And so I'm thinking like every time I go to the gym, that's like one more day I could have pizza and beer, and so that keeps me motivated some. So then you might think like, hey, I got this bright idea, Rosie. Why don't we just start giving people CCK and peptide YY, and I bet they start losing weight, right? The problem is they don't. And part of the problem with this is hunger, because remember, what were those 2 things you have to do to stay alive? have to breathe and you have to eat. And breathing is pretty straightforward, right? It's just like in and out, in and out, in and out. So we're not going to mess with that. But eating is very complicated, right, Sydney? So we're going to have multiple backup mechanisms, right? Because if one of these gets screwed up, and that was the only thing that was making you hungry, guess what happens? You don't eat anymore, and you die, and that's bad. But if we have 4 or 5 things, and one of those kind of gets screwed up, the other 3 or 4 will still work, and they'll still make you hungry, and you'll still eat, right? And so you can stay alive. So we're going to have multiple sort of things that are going on. All right. So what stops a meal? This is when the wait staff comes out with the check. That's what stops the meal, right? And then some of you who are faster than others get up and run, right? Kind of tailored people do that to you. They leave you with the check. You do that to people. Never? No, never thought about it. Have you ever had this debate, like you're sitting there? So this frustrates me sometimes. If you have to like wait at a restaurant a long time, like I've already eaten and I'm sitting there for a long time, they haven't brought the check out. There's always this like timer that I start, and it just like depends on how irritated I am that day. And if that right, Sydney? And if that timer goes off, I'm just gonna leave. Like if you've not brought me the check after I've been sitting there waiting so long, I'm just gonna leave because you should have brought it to me. It's your fault if you didn't, right? I mean, it's not like 2 minutes, you know, but if I'm there like 15 or 20 minutes and nobody, I'm just gonna leave. Right? You should have done a better job. That's a lesson. There are negative consequences, right? I've never done that. I've been close a couple times. I've been close. Like I look at my wife and I was like, I think I'm just gonna leave. She's like, no, I think we should. I was like, no, I think I'm just gonna leave. Like if you weren't here, I would have already been gone. Because that's how irritated I am about this. But whatever. What stops a meal? Livers. Hey, what happens when your liver starts to get nutrients? Well, tells the rest of your body, hey, you need to stop eating, sends a signal to your brain. The liver is actually the first organ outside of your intestines to get nutrients, right? So as soon as your intestine starts pumping nutrients out, the first place it goes is the liver. And we know if we're delivering nutrients safely to the liver, we're going to get nutrients elsewhere, right? And if we're getting nutrients elsewhere, well, then we're going to be fine, so we can stop eating. So once we've got nutrients going to the liver, we can stop eating. It's not a big deal. So there you go. What do we know about insulin receptors? These are actually kind of interesting. There are insulin receptors in your brain, right? Or that can detect insulin, or insulin detectors in your body that look for the insulin in your blood. They send signals up to your brain. If insulin is present, that means we have glucose in our blood, right? Because we're going to use that insulin to take the glucose and make glycogen. And if we're in that phase, that means we're in the absorptive phase, right? So we know we've got food present if there's a lot of glucose in our blood, right? Because if there's a lot of glucose, we're going to have insulin to put that into that long-term storage. So if we know we have a lot of insulin floating around, then that could give us a satiety signal as well. We can know we're full and we don't have to eat anymore. So that's exciting, right? All right. How have we learned a lot about this? And some of the signals that come from, in particular, adipose tissue. How many of you remember when we talked about kisspeptin? Right, and we said kisspeptin is what initiates puberty. We said that was under the control of leptin. And we said leptin comes from adipose tissue, right? Well, some folks got together and they made what they call the OB mouse. And this is a mouse that is not able to produce leptin. Okay? So because it never produces leptin, okay, the effect of leptin is to reduce food intake, right? So if you're at the point where you have some adipose tissue stored, that's a long-term energy storage. So you can say, I don't have to eat as much. I've got that long-term energy stored. I can use that, right, instead of trying to absorb more. So I'm good. If like this mouse, this guy, both of these are actually OB mice. So both of these have the inability to produce leptin properly, right? So they're not producing leptin. This is an untreated mouse. You can kind of see how much weight he gained. This mouse, much more similar to like a normal-sized mouse, it actually received leptin injections every day. So it received an injection of leptin. which reduced its food intake and therefore its weight gain. So that's kind of interesting, right? So then you also think, well, why don't we just give people leptin? Well, it doesn't really work as well, right? It might have some effect, but it's not going to be helpful because, again, we have all of those other sort of backup mechanisms. So it's a very difficult thing to treat. I'm not going to ask you too much about cutting brains, right? So don't worry about that, but what I do want to think about a little bit is the hypothalamus. Okay. In particular, we talked before about the ventral medial hypothalamus and that lateral hypothalamus, right? And in animals where you destroy their lateral hypothalamus, they actually stop eating and drinking, right? So the lateral hypothalamus is clearly a nucleus that drives eating and drinking. And in fact, if you stimulate the lateral hypothalamus, animals will start eating and or drinking, right? So they'll do one or both of those activities. So you can go in, you can just like zap them in the lateral hypothalamus, and then they start eating, which is kind of exciting. Another part of the hypothalamus called the ventromedial hypothalamus does the opposite. If you stimulate that, then you actually have sort of overeating, right? So the animals will continue to overeat. If you were to destroy that region, then they would stop eating as much, right? This is just showing you the location of the lateral hypothalamus and the ventromedial hypothalamus. You can think about lateral hypothalamus for hunger, and then the ventral hypothalamus for satiety. Not a big deal. However, one sort of interesting molecule in this process is orexin. You guys remember orexin from the sleep chapter, right? And we said if orexin is present, then we will actually kind of stay awake, right? And so we can think about orexin and its effect on like hunger signals as well. So they're kind of going hand in hand here. So orexin has an excitatory effect on eating, and it'll actually sort of reduce your metabolic rate a little bit. And then there's this weird story with like melanin concentrating hormone, right? So this is sort of weird that people even have this, right? So melanin is a skin pigment. Amphibians have melanin concentrating hormone because amphibians can change the distribution of the melanin in their skin, right? And so that's why to like concentrate melanin, they can kind of control this if they're going to, like change their color patterns or something on their skin. Humans have melanin concentrating hormone as well. Obviously, we're not able to kind of change the color patterns of our skin, right? Nobody's going to go like, I'm going to turn myself striped and blend in with this wall. It doesn't really work that way. So you could try it. I don't think it's going to work. If you were some other animal, you could probably pull this off, but not humans. But those neurons actually seem to play a role in hunger as well, which is kind of interesting. I don't know why it's the same. It's kind of an interesting story. Oh, hey, we should talk about endocannabinoids a little bit, right? How many of you have heard of cannabinoids? Nobody's going to raise their hand on that. There you go. Thanks for being honest. So there are two kinds of cannabinoids, really, right? We think about the phytocannabinoids. These are cannabinoids that come from a plant source, right? I think most of you can guess which plant source that is. That's the marijuana plant source, right? The other cannabinoids are what we call endocannabinoids. These are actually cannabinoids you create, right? So you create molecules that activate these cannabinoid receptors. As we said before, if a drug will work on your body, that means you have some similar chemical in your body that you make that operates those receptors, right, that mediate that effect, and cannabinoids are the same way. What's one of the, I'll say the side effects, because it's not necessarily the desired effect of marijuana consumption, but what's one of the side effects of marijuana consumption? That would be like directly related to the content of this lecture. Hunger. Yeah, hunger and munchies, right? And that's a lot of people joke around about, but it's a real thing, right? And so often they will administer cannabinoids to individuals who have like wasting disease, right? If they're not eating, they're losing weight, right? So this is a good medical application of cannabinoids if you think about folks who are on serious chemotherapy, right? Often they don't have an appetite, they don't want to eat, and you can imagine like because of the problems with their stomachs that result from chemotherapy, this might happen. But you can use cannabinoids to kind of stimulate that hunger, right? And so then they will start to eat more, and they can sort of gain some appetite there. So that's sort of a most of the time. I mean, I don't know if people think about like using cannabinoids in that way, but that's one way. Sort of the opposite of that, if you were to block your cannabinoid receptors, you can actually, and there are drugs that do this, you can actually kind of lose weight that way, right? Because you're not going to be stimulating your appetite. So that's kind of a fun. Why did we go that far? Hold on. There we go. So that's just sort of a different way to think about cannabinoids and their use, right? Any questions about that? Okay. Hunger, don't worry about that too much. And we probably shouldn't think about this too much. We already talked about leptin. That's really the most I'm going to ask you about, and its ability to cause satiety. We should talk sort of briefly about obesity, right? And some of the things that are going on there. This is definitely a widespread health problem, right? And there are some serious consequences beyond increasing your body weight. Some of those being things we've already talked about. Diabetes, high blood pressure, there are a ton of cardiovascular issues you need to think about. On top of that, you can have some joint issues, so you have mobility issues, things like that. So I think it's important to sort of address that, think about that a little bit. There are a ton of reasons why this may be happening. Some of those are going to be environmental, physical activities, and then there are genetic sort of activities, factors as well that can result in this. Now, this has seemed to have a steady increase in particular over the last few decades, right, that we've seen an increase in obesity. In particular, there has been an increase in like childhood obesity, right, and so younger kids are starting to get into this category. Again, it's not really an issue of the body weight itself, right, so I want to be clear about that. It's more of a concern, sort of the related health issues, right? But I think like body weight and body image are definitely problems that people carry around, and we'll talk about other eating disorders as well, right? Anorexia nervosa, we'll talk about that as well. I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not about like how much you weigh or how you look, but it's concerns about those additional health issues, right? Nobody looks great with high blood pressure, right? Because those people are dead, so watch out for that. That was a real sad story, wasn't it, Taylor? Yeah. Why would we see an increase in this over the last couple decades? One of the reasons is, we should talk about BMI. How many of you know your BMI? Anybody track this stuff? Total waste of time. The BMI, your BMI is not really a great predictor of your health. A lot of folks will use this, right? A lot of these were actually developed by insurance companies, right? So Jacob, if you can put more people in these categories, then you can charge them more for their insurance, right? That seems pretty brilliant. Not allowed to do that anymore. So that's something. But these BMI scores still kind of hang out there, right? For those of you that are athletes, right? Your BMI is going to be who knows where on this, right? Your BMI could be way up here, but you're perfectly fine, right? So again, not really works for about 4 people that your BMI like actually tells you something important about you. There are a lot of other things you should use instead of this. So I just hate when people get really caught up on. Your doctor will still use these though, right? You'll go in, they're like, oh man, your BMI is a whatever, and that puts you in some category. Think about the other things that are actually important, right? Like, what's your blood pressure? Do you have diabetes? You dealing with some cardiovascular problems or not? I think those are far more important. All right, we already know about that. Let's think about some of the environmental factors, right? Again, we talked about food is relatively inexpensive, right? And it's far less expensive now than it has been in the past, right? So if you think about for what most of you invest in food, it's really not that much money, right? And how you know it's not that much money is how many of you have a cell phone bill that you pay? Yeah, how many of you have you pay for Netflix or Hulu, a gym membership? How many of you pay for a car insurance? Yeah, right. Hands are going up. Okay. Guess what? A lot of people. I thought I smelled something. There's like an odd odor up here, like something. No one else smells that. Yeah, we'll find out if something catches on fire. Those are. See, Rosie, that's why I care about things. If something catches on fire, we know it's a problem. We've got sprinklers. I assume they work. I'll assume they work until they don't. See, so those are all sort of expenses that are not necessary, right, for your existence, and those are expenses that didn't exist even 100 years ago, right, or 150 years ago, and so much more of your money and or time went to making or buying food, right? So that tells you how much more expensive food used to be than it is now, right? And so you can spend less and less of your money on food, and you can spend more and more of your money on, digital streaming services, right? So there you go, right? You've got all this kind of expendable income you didn't even realize you had, right? You can get rid of your cell phone, you can get rid of your car, maybe not get rid of your car, right? No, but you can get rid of some of these other things, right? And again, they're expenses that people didn't have in the past. So food is less expensive than it used to be. It's also less expensive in terms of like human involvement, right? Like human effort. Most of the farms now are these massive operations that use these giant machines to process food. All of that had to be done by hand in the past. So that's another way that it's less expensive now than it used to be, right? Food's also very convenient. How many of you have a refrigerator? Yeah, like almost everybody, right? Guess what? 100 years ago, you didn't, right? And so food is so much more convenient now. How many of you have food in your refrigerator or freezer that has been there for months? Yeah, and that's normal, right, Caroline? That's not bad. I mean, how many of you how many of you have some frozen pizzas in your refrigerator, right? And those things have a sell-by date like decade from now, right? And so that's fine. Not something in the past, right? Used to you ate whatever you like sliced off the cow as it was running away from you, right? And it was good just as long as you could get it back to your grill or your oven, right? Now we have preservatives. I'm not going to say anything good or bad about preservatives. They're there. We have refrigeration. We have other techniques to preserve food, so it's very convenient for us, right? So it's there. It's available. On top of that, and this is why in the last couple decades we've seen a big increase. There was sort of an economic shift in the United States in the last 20 to 30 years where more and more households have shifted from a single earner to a dual earner household, right? And I would say that most of you, because this is the case for most people, have grown up in a dual earner household, like both of your parents had jobs, right? For most of you that's the case. It's not everybody. That has become more and more common, and it started becoming more common about 20 to 30 years ago, right? And so the other thing that came along about 20 or 30 years ago was the Lunchable and the Capri Sun. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with either of those, right? Okay, and those are awesome, and they were originally intended to be these nice convenience foods once a week, right? And so because your mom and your dad are both working, there's not one of them home that's going to be able to make these homemade sort of lunches for you. And instead what you're going to need are these sort of quick and easy meals, right? And these quick and easy foods that people can eat. The problem with these is they're very, again, very convenient. They're very palatable. They're very easy, right? They seem like a good meal. I mean, a Lunchable, it's got meat, cheese, crackers. Seems like the real deal, right? But the problem is because they have high sodium content and they have these other things, continuing to eat those on a daily basis can be problematic, and sort of these foods that were originally designed to be sort of treats once in a while became sort of staples that people were eating several days a week, and that's led to some health problems. So that's an interesting story, right? You guys didn't think about that. The Capri Sun is the death knell for us. And that's knell with a K-N-E-L-L, in case you wanted to know, not death nail like a nail in a coffin, right? That's a different sort of phrase. A death knell is like the bell, right? Ringing, it's a knell. So it's always like to make sure that I clarify that, because I think some of you would call it a death nail, like with a hammer, and that's wrong. It's no. Right, Morgan? Does that bother you when people do stuff like that? Yeah. So the other one that bothers me is keel over, and it is keel. It's not an accent that I have. Some people say kill over, but it's keel because it's the boat, right? So the boat has a keel on the bottom, and when your boat keels over, then everybody's been dumped out, right? So the bottom ridge on a boat is the keel. So that's important. So there you go. Any other questions about sayings that you think are correct but they're not? None of those will be on the exam, but they're just important for you in your life. So there you go. Also, we have these high-calorie foods, snack foods. How many of you eat like these little, anybody eat protein bars? Yeah, how many calories are in those things? Like a ton sometimes, right? There might be like 300 calories or more in some of these little, they're like this big, right? There's like these like super packed bars, and you think, well, like, I'm just going to eat like, oh, these things are little. I'll eat 2 of those, right? And you're like, oh man, that was like 650 calories right there. So that happens. Lots of snack foods, and we put sugar in everything now, right? How many of you have ever looked at the ingredients like in your spaghetti sauce, right? And you're just like, why is all of that in there? I think I just need some herbs and some tomatoes. That's spaghetti sauce, right? And they just put sugar in things that you think like, oh, I don't need sugar in there. So there you go. But there's really no way around it, right? Because how many of you are taking the time to make all of your stuff at home that you eat? Yeah, nobody, right? There are a few weirdos that do that, but who knows what they're doing. What about physical activity? Typically, there are a couple things we do for physical activity. Unfortunately, most of us don't have as much physical activity at work as we would have had in the past, right? More and more of our jobs require less and less physical labor. Okay, so we're not really getting that exercise that we would at work. Even folks who work in the same industry, if you think about farming, right? For example, if you were a farmer 100 years ago, you were expending a certain amount of energy that's much more than a farmer today, right? Because a farmer today is just like riding in a tractor. He's got his Bluetooth speakers and his air conditioning, right? I'm not saying it's not a hard, difficult job. I'm not making light of that at all. But it's not what it was, some time ago. Also, compared to hunter-gatherers, right? Our energy expenditure is quite a bit less, right? So if you were a hunter-gatherer, what were you doing with your time? You were hunting or gathering, right? You were doing one of those two things. You weren't reading books, right? You weren't sitting around playing checkers. You weren't playing video games, right? You weren't doing all of those things. If you had downtime, guess what you were doing? You were repairing or making implements for your hunting and your gathering, right? And so you were going to go back out and you were going to hunt and you were going to gather and you were going to get extra food that way. This is one of the reasons why, until the advent of a few sort of big innovations, one of those being sort of agriculture, right, and cultivating crops. Until that point, it was very difficult for our species to sort of get above these hunter-gatherer societies, right? Because we were continuing to just be able to go out and hunt or gather enough food to try to get us through until the next time we could go out and hunt and gather food, right? And so all of our energy was going toward hunting and gathering, right? And so if you think about that, now we spend so much less time, again, trying to procure food, right? So little of your time is actually spent doing that. And even if you start thinking, well, like, I have a job, and so much of that job's going to food, think about how much of your budget is actually your food, right? And then figure out, like, how much time you had to work to pay for that food, and then the rest of the time you're working is actually going to other stuff, right? So there you go. What about genetic factors? You know, there are some genetic factors. I'm not really going to ask you too much about these. There are some folks that have higher or lower metabolism. There are folks who are leptin resistant, right? So leptin may not work for you. Guess what's going to happen then? You're going to continue to eat, right? Even though leptin is being released, you're not going to be recognizing that. It actually makes sense to have, like a thrifty phenotype, right? So if you were really great at storing up energy, that sounds like an awesome thing to do, right? And again, in an environment where you did not know where your next meal was going to be, you did not know what amount of effort you were going to have to put forward to procure that food, being able to store as much of that energy as possible and not use it immediately was great, right? Because that could help you get through periods of time where foodstuffs were not as readily available. Today, where, I mean, how many of you eat your meals at the exact same time every day? A lot of people do, right, Jacob? I mean, that's a regular thing. A lot of people eat 3 meals a day at the exact same time, right? And you might know, some people might know when they're having their next 15 or 20 meals, and they might know what they're having for those, right? Some people plan their meals a week or 2 weeks ahead of time, right? And so when you're thinking about a situation where that's possible, we really don't need to be storing up very much at all for long-term storage, right? Because we know, hey, that meal's coming next. The problem is we didn't evolve a mechanism to go, hey, I know when my next meal is, so all of these calories and things, I can just get rid of them, right? So we're going to try to hang on to that stuff. Why is obesity so difficult to treat? Lots of folks think about this as a like a form of addiction, right? Like overeating is a form of addiction, which it has all of the same hallmarks that we'll talk about later with drug use. It causes some of the same increases in dopamine in some of the same places as drug use would. Lots of folks, you probably know someone who has lost a bunch of weight, and then they've gained that weight back. They lose weight, and then they gain weight, right? You can think about that as relapse, right? So somebody's been able to control their eating, and then they are no longer able to control that eating. So those things happen. So it's really some similarities there to obesity and drug use. The big problem is, again, you don't need cocaine to live. You do need food to live, right? And so you can always, one of the first things they'll tell someone who is recovering from drug use is get into a different environment where you're not around drugs anymore, right? You cannot tell someone go into an environment where you're not around food anymore. You know, how do you do that? There's no way to do that, right? It's just impossible. So that's a little bit of a problem. Now, there are some surgeries that folks do. You know, if you're considering any of these, I always like to throw this out. Make sure you talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about, right? And try other things first. Because I think it's pretty kind of a big deal when you start like cutting around on your stomach and your internal organs and trying to make things smaller, right? So you feel fuller faster, you eat less. This doesn't seem like something should be like your first option. Like, hey, think you can like repipe my digestive system for me? Try some other things first. But this does seem to be effective. It happens for folks. You know, when they have it, they'll lose weight. Seems to work well. Basically, the other sort of things are, you know, what are the pharmacological interventions? There are drugs that people take that help with weight loss. A lot of those have some nasty side effects, right? So you really got to be careful about those. The other thing that you can do sort of like behaviorally is just increase your physical activity, right? If you're having trouble regulating the amount of food that you eat, try to increase your physical activity. Although a lot of folks will run into some problems there because you have to do other things like go to work, come to class, take a shower, right? I guess you could always try to put a treadmill in your shower. Try to exercise while you're, I don't know, I'm trying to like, you know, save time for you guys. They have those treadmill desks, right? Have you seen those? Where they have these like desks that have treadmills you can like walk while you're working. Just kind of interesting. I don't know if that's a good idea. I'm trying to like, how well can I type while I'm like walking back and forth on a treadmill? I don't know. But the next time my neighbor throws away a treadmill, I'm going to take it. I'm going to try to make a desk out of it. It does, and it is a good idea to get up because part of the problem is the blood that gets into your legs doesn't really come out of your legs unless you squeeze the muscles in your legs, right? Because you've got to like work those pumps. So, I don't know. We could try it, right? Do you have a walking desk? No. Well, there you go. What are you going to do? That's what we should get. I should install walking desks in this room. Make all of you walk while we're doing class. Huh? I think so, right? Right? That's going to work. All right. There's a chart. That's great. You guys, we've already talked about that. We should talk briefly about other eating disorders. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. The first thing I want to say is if you or someone you know is dealing with an eating disorder, I recommend, or you should recommend, that that person actually gets professional help on this, right? Eating disorders are a pretty serious deal. We actually have, just as a heads up, just going up 3 flights of stairs, or you can take the elevator, although we've just talked about increasing physical activity, so maybe we should mention the stairs. We've got folks upstairs who will help you for free, right, if you're dealing with an eating disorder. If they're not able to help you out appropriately, they will refer you to someone who can. So these are serious things that you should take into account, because eating disorders definitely can lead to death, right? So that's a problem. Recently, there has been an increase in the diagnosis. I won't say an increase in the incidence rate, right? But an increase in the diagnosis of eating disorders in males, right? So there's some idea that maybe eating disorders might manifest differently in males versus females, and so you may see that in some different behaviors. But so keep that in mind. So it's not just females that deal with eating disorders. There are a variety of eating disorders that you could be dealing with, or someone else could be dealing with. Some are more obvious for you to see than others, right? We always like to think about anorexia nervosa or binge eating disorder. The problem with this is that they're very difficult to treat, right? It's very difficult to treat an eating disorder because there are a lot of underlying sort of neurological mechanisms that are at play here. Typically, cognitive behavior therapy seems to be the best approach, right? Seems to be the most effective. There are some other approaches. We've talked about some pharmacological interventions to try to get people to eat. However, the problem is if somebody is not eating because they're concerned about their body image, getting them to take some medication that might cause them to eat doesn't seem like something they would really be willing to do, right? So you kind of run into some issues there. Here's just a chart to kind of break down the different types of eating disorders and some of those conditions. What I would like to point out to you is sort of brain changes in differences in folks with and without anorexia. So this brain over on the right-hand side of your screen, this is a normal brain. You can look at the sulci right here at the top, the sulci, and the size of your ventricles. If you look at an individual who has anorexia, you can see enlarged ventricles. You can see sort of decreased gray and white matter here. You can see these bigger sulci in the cortex. So you can see these individuals are clearly having some problems. A lot of this can be related to nutritional intake, right? If you're not eating the the foods and such that you need, then that can really create some problems. You're not able to maintain and operate your brain appropriately, which is really something to watch out for. So eating disorders are serious. Watch out for that. If you have it, if you know someone who is dealing with this, there are lots of places you can get help and get that taken care of. All right. Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? That's sort of the end of what I wanted to cover for today.